So it's 3 o'clock, so I'm gonna get started. I'm Sky, I'm leading our workshop today. And I'll start by introducing myself, but I would love, as some people have already been doing, if people wanna introduce themselves in the chat so you can get to know each other, that would be awesome. You can put like name, pronouns, whatever you want to share with us today is beautiful. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen. So welcome to Creating Community Archives, Documenting Trans Jewish Lives. I'm Sky Karp. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm finishing up my last year at Smith College, where I've been really passionate about documenting, creating trans Jewish histories and archives. There we go. So to start off, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. What are archives? Quite simply, they're the permanent records that people create. So anything that you put out into the world, whether it be sort of material or virtual, that can count, right? It might be letters, oral histories, manuscripts, photographs, film, really anything. And this is the way that we understand history. It's the evidence of the lives that we've lived. Now you might be asking, well, why should I care? Why is this important? Aren't archives just like dusty old books, like whatever? So I think there's two reasons. The first is that creating a community-based archive together can allow us to tell the stories that are left outside of mainstream histories and institutions. So most like standard university archives do not have a lot of material on trans people, never mind trans Jews. And so by sort of coming together as a community, we can say this is important, our stories and our histories matter, and we want to preserve them and collect them and distribute them for our community to have. The second piece is that by doing this in a community-centered way, we can make sure that our histories are also more accessible. So most standard university archives, you like have to show your ID, you have to prove you're a researcher, you have to have a way to get there, you have to like know how to navigate like archive spaces. But we can, as a community, sort of let that take other forms that's much more accessible to people, the internet being a resource to do that. So we can say, oh, we want to put this on our website, or we want to keep it in our synagogue or in our community center, and have it be really in the hands of the community instead of like locked away in some library somewhere. And a personal anecdote to demonstrate this is that my first year at Smith, I was really getting into like trans history at Smith. I wanted to do a final research paper on it. I went into the Smith College archives, and I went up to the archives. Sorry, one sec. Okay. Ugh. Nope, it's not gone yet. Give me one sec. I'm really sorry. Okay, sorry about that. Sometimes my Spotify just like starts playing randomly. It's weird. My computer's messed up. But what I was saying is that, so I was at the Smith Archives and I went up to the archivist and I'd said, like, I'm really interested in, trans history. What do we have? And the archivist was like, sorry, we don't have anything on that. What else are you interested in for this project? There's just this moment of like almost total erasure, like, wow, like my history isn't here. My presence is not felt here at this school. Like no one has even bothered to like document or include trans people. And sort of knowing how shitty that felt, that moment of erasure and invisibility, today's Trans Day of Visibility, that has really inspired me to dedicate a lot of time to making sure that our histories and our stories are included and are told. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about some trans and Jewish archives throughout history and today, to give us some context, and then we'll dive right into some skills that we can use to actually create a community archive. Best examples of a community archive is the Ringelblum Archive. And this was a group of social workers, scholars, historians, rabbis in the Warsaw Ghetto who decided that they wanted to document what was happening there. And they interviewed people, they collected documents, diaries, essays. And at first they were going to publish a book out of it. But when it became clear that most of them wouldn't survive, they buried all these boxes. You see them excavating it in the slide. They buried all these boxes to be recovered later. And it's like this really powerful example of like, even though most of them didn't survive, their stories and their histories did, because they took the time to document them and to record them. And a really powerful example of community members coming together during like one of the most oppressive times, to say like, our stories matter and we're going to record them and we're going to keep them safe. And then on the flip side, we have Magnus Hirschfeld. So if you don't know who he was a Jewish gay man and a sexologist. And in the early 1900s, he had this Institute of Sex Research. And he had this like treasure trove of archival materials that he'd collected about all of his research with queer and trans people and gender variant people, like hundreds of interviews and field notes and research. And almost all of it was destroyed by the Nazis. He was based in Berlin. And there's a little bit that remains there, but almost all of it was destroyed. So we also see that there's also this history of erasure where marginalized sort of trans and Jewish lives their histories are also have been erased and invisibilized. And so it speaks to just how important it is that we work to sort of counter that erasure and make sure, again, that our histories are told. So a couple examples of sort of innovative trans and Jewish archives today. So on our left, we have the Jewish Women's Archive, which, as it sounds, they collect and write about and sort of contextualize Jewish women's history. But they do include some trans people. So we see in this example, Leslie Feinberg is featured on their website, who was a working class lesbian, transgender activist and communist. And then there's also the Digital Transgender Archive, which basically all it does is that it digitizes, it puts on the internet this like broad range of trans materials, make sure that they're just all on the internet and accessible to everyone. So what's great about these two things is that they are both super accessible. They're on the internet. Anyone can look them up and have access to these materials. I think the sort of clear thing that we see that they don't do is that there's no trans Jewish archive, right? There's a Jewish Women's Archive and a trans archive. And there's not a trans Jewish archive that I know of, which again speaks to how important this work that we're doing today is, because there's still this huge gap in our archives, in our institutions, in the historical record that needs to be filled with trans Jewish stories. Oh wait, okay, I'm gonna stop sharing just for a sec. And now that we've sort of had some context, we've talked about some examples, I'd love it if everyone would just put in the chat, what do you think would make a really great trans Jewish archive? Like, what would it need to have? What characteristics would it have to have? What would it do in our dream archive world? Global, yeah, definitely. Multimedia, cool. Mm. Yeah, accessible. Yeah, so I'm seeing like a lot about access, which is really important, which I think I talked about a bit before. Like not too academic, right? Which also it goes into access, like anyone is able to sort of understand it. Yeah, a wider definition of what's Jewish, kind of like diversity, I think, of both like what the archive is about and maybe like the materials that are included, like lots of different mediums I'm also seeing. Um, audio recordings. Yeah, we're actually gonna life stories. We're gonna actually talk about in a minute. So that's awesome. Yeah, and a wide definition of what's trans. Yeah, so I think like awesome. Yeah, search criteria. Yeah, so like some key things that I'm seeing: accessibility, diversity of materials, both who's included and the physical materials that are in it. And I think I'm not sure if someone has named this yet, but also like a community archive should be, I think, created by and for the community it's supposed to be serving, right? So if we have a trans Jewish archive, it should predominantly be created by trans Jews. But that, thank you for all your contributions. I think that was really awesome and helps us to like really zero in on what this could look like. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen again. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the actual methods that we can use to create these kinds of community-based archives of our dreams. So I'm going to start off by talking about oral histories. So oral history is the collection and study of history through interviews of people with knowledge of past events, which basically means anyone who has lived a life, has experienced history, you can interview them and create a really poignant life history by asking them a set of strategic questions. And this is a really great method for queer and trans people and documenting their lives and stories, because queerness, transness has been shrouded with such secrecy and shame and silences. People didn't necessarily record, like they didn't necessarily want to record physical materials because that could potentially out them or leave a paper trail. But by interviewing a queer or trans elder about their experience, we can sort of help to fill in those gaps that are missing from like traditional materials. So what we're going to do now is we're going to read this article about oral history that I believe should be appearing in the chat soon. And when you're done reading, maybe just put something in the chat or like react in some way so that I know you're done, and then we'll talk about it. Is anyone still reading? No, for the most part. You can, it's also fine to skim. Okay, so now that we have a little more context about what an oral history looks like, people, you can either put in the chat or you can also just unmute yourself. Like, what are maybe some of the gaps in the history that you see that you would want to use an oral history to like document? And this doesn't have to be limited to trans Jews. It could be any sort of like marginalized group or issue that you would want to, you wish there was more about.
I do not for trans Jews, but for Judaism in particular. I wish there was more like representation of working class Jewish people. Yeah, yeah. Like my ancestors were all working class. You know, and I'm sure a lot of yours were too. And there's not. It's a lot of like when you look back, it's a lot of like the rabbis and the children of the rabbis. And I wish there was more. You know, the pickle sellers on the streets of Brighton Beach.
Does anyone else have thoughts about like what might be missing from, oh yeah, more about trans people and ACT UP. That's a good thought for sure. Rav, would you like to?
Yeah, first this is totally awesome. I love you, and I sent you a private message. I mean, I love the whole group because so important, right? Just it's like the basic fundamental bottom line, like validation of existence level of importance. And so therefore, I would love to hear more about, or maybe it's evolving, about the gatekeeping issues and who controls, who determines who is important enough to document. And then that would include that we need to document everybody, including the regular, normal, not rabbinic type people, but across the board, not institutional, also people in institutions, right? And mainstream and have that recognition. But in a marginalized community, so many people are gonna not come from institutional perspective. So how do we include the whole community?
Yeah, I think that's really big. And that's like part of what makes the like archives, traditional archives, so gatekeeping, is that you have one person, right? The archivist is deciding like what matters and what gets kept or not. So that was really great, really like highlighting how those power structures work. Yeah, Jewish, disabled, and or neurodivergent stories of liberation, or honestly any disabled neurodivergent stories. I think that's also really
yeah, because like the thing is, when you have one person then deciding, like you were just saying, who's worthy of the stories getting told, the answer, where are the gaps in history, becomes so hard to answer because there are so many, it's overwhelming.
Yeah, totally, right? I mean, even like trans Jews is like pretty niche, but even here, right, we're seeing like there's so many different categories of people that have been excluded. Yeah, that's awesome. Cool. Okay, any last thoughts on this before we move on?
Hi, I'm Talia.
Hi.
Came in late, but I work at a museum, and so this is a really interesting, at a Jewish museum, so this is really top of mind for me. And I think, speaking of the gatekeeping, another group, not just the archivist, but also the board, the lay leaders, that is a really influential part of our collections because we have to get our materials approved by the collections committee. So just to add to that.
Yeah, that's another important point. There's, I think, a lot of like powerful stakeholders in the sort of museum archives world that get to kind of make all the decisions about what gets preserved and stored. Okay, cool. Thank you all. So now we're going to move on to actually practicing a little oral history, which is very fun. So we're going to go into breakout rooms in a moment. And just tell the other person, or it should be groups of 2 or 3, but tell the other people a little bit about your lives and talk about what might be an interesting element to conduct a history around. And if you have time, you can also come up with some sample questions you might want to ask each other. Cool. Cool. Welcome back, everyone. Does maybe just like a couple people want to share out what they talked about really quick? You can also put it in the chat if that feels more comfortable. Mm-hmm. Was anyone able to like come up with any questions together? Or general themes? Okay, if not, that's cool too. If you think of something, oh, we have. Miranda and I talked about how rewarding, oh, sorry, I lost it. Transness itself is for trans people. Comforts of euphoria and self-exploration. That's awesome. Amazing. Rob and I got to have a lovely conversation on how intergenerational spaces are wonderful and give both sides of the combo so much hope. These are so beautiful. I'm glad you had these amazing conversations. Okay, so, oh, there's another one. Differences and similarities in experiences between the US and the UK. Concerns of over medicalizing the trans experience through interview questions. That's definitely a really big thing for sure. Cool. Yeah, that is a great take. Okay, amazing. You can keep putting things in the chat if you would like, but I will share my screen again and we will continue on. Okay. Okay, great, beautiful. So, okay, so another great way to create community-based archives are zines. If you don't know what they are, they're sort of self-produced, self-published pamphlets or magazines, kind of centering self-expression and creativity, and found often among like activist-y circles. And sometimes people will like photocopy them and distribute them, or they'll publish online. But it's like a more kind of personal, accessible way to share your story or your history. So we're going to look at the Queer Zine Archive project right now while it's loading. Okay, so this is really cool. It's an archive of a bunch of different zines that have been created, queer zines specifically, and you can sort by all these different things. I'm going to click on decades. Okay, so let's look at the 1990s. Cool. And you can see there's all these different zines. Oh, look, here's ACT UP. That's cool. And let's also look at, this is like the OG trans Jew zine, Tum Tum. And so you could see, in general, this is an archive of all the different zines, right? But within one zine, there's all these different things. There's like a dictionary definition. This looks like a reflection, some art, a quote from this book about the sewers of Lavore, a letter, So the zine itself as a unit also serves as a kind of archive. It's this collection of all these different materials about a certain topic or issue. So we don't have time to make zines today, unfortunately, and we're also on Zoom, so that might be difficult. But there will be a link dropped in the chat about how to make them if you're interested. And that will happen quickly. Cool. So now we're just going to go on to our closing activity. So to pull everything we've learned together today, we're going to create our own archive of the Trans Jews Are Here Convening 2021. And so, right, this convening is super historic. We're in this pandemic. There's like 20 states with terrible transphobic bills right now. It's Trans Day of Visibility. This day is super important and should certainly be documented. So I want everyone to take a few minutes to capture or create something that documents your experience today. So you might take a selfie, you could take a picture of an email or a text, create a video, a voice recording, write a journal entry, make some kind of art. You could create a zine about your experience today. And if you're feeling kind of stuck, you might reflect on your favorite moments from today, something that challenged you, or maybe a unique perspective that's not included yet, right? Filling those gaps in our archive. And so if you're comfortable, I would really, really love it if you would share whatever you create in this shared Google Drive folder, which will be in the chat. Do note that it will be shared publicly with the conference attendees. So if you don't want other people to share it, to see it, don't put it there. But if you're comfortable with that, I would love to share it with everyone. And you can also stay anonymous if you would like. Yeah, so you can message me if you have questions, but otherwise go forth and create things. So yeah, we have about 3 minutes left. If anyone wants to like share any more about what they made or what that was like for them, feel free to unmute yourself or put something in the chat. But otherwise, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having the seminar, Sky. This was really awesome.
Thanks.